The cold did not wait for winter that year. It came early, sharp and merciless, like a warning no one wanted to hear. Somewhere beneath the frozen hills of Montana, in the black belly of the earth, a woman held her daughter and listened to the wind try to tear the world apart. The fire in the small iron stove had burned down to nothing. The last log was ash. The last ember was fading, and the thermometer nailed to the limestone wall had lost its mercury entirely, which meant the temperature outside had fallen below anything the instrument could measure. The girl was 9 years old. Her name was Lily. She had not spoken in 2 days. Her breath came shallow and fast, like a small bird trapped behind glass, and her skin burned with fever even as the world outside froze solid. Clara Hargrove pressed her palm flat against the stone wall. It was warm, not hot, not comfortable, but warm in a way that did not change, did not waver, did not depend on fire or wood or the mercy of men. The earth held its own heat, quiet and deep, the way a mother holds a child she refuses to release. "The ground is still breathing for us, Lily," Clara whispered into her daughter's hair. "The ground does not forget." The girl did not answer, but her small fingers found her mother's wrist and held on. 5 months earlier, in the dog days of August 1886, none of this had happened yet. The hum of the Elkhorn mine still filled the valley like a pulse, steady and mechanical, the sound of the earth being opened and emptied, one cartload at a time. Men still descended into darkness each morning and returned each evening caked in dust, bent with exhaustion, older than they had been at dawn. The company houses lined the hillside in identical rows, thin pine walls, tin roofs, a single stovepipe, each built not for comfort but for function, the way you build a pen for animals you intend to use and replace. The town of Elkhorn, Montana existed for one reason and would die for the same reason. Copper and silver lived in the rock beneath it, and men came from every corner of the country to tear that rock apart with pickaxes and dynamite and bare hands, feeding it into the stamp mills that thundered day and night, crushing ore into powder and powder into profit. The profit went east to offices in New York and Boston, where men in starched collars studied ledgers and decided the fates of families they would never meet. The dust and the noise and the danger stayed in Elkhorn. Thomas Hargrove had been one of those men. Broad across the shoulders, quiet in his manner, with hands the size of shovels and handwriting so fine it surprised everyone who saw it. He had come to mining the way most men came to it, not by choice but by the slow elimination of other options. He had tried farming in the Gallatin Valley and failed when 2 consecutive droughts burned his crops to stubble. He had tried carpentry in Helena and found that the market was flooded with men who could swing a hammer. The mine was what remained when everything else had been crossed off the list, and Thomas took it the way a man takes medicine without pleasure, because the alternative was worse. But Thomas Hargrove had a gift that set him apart from the other miners, a gift that would echo through his daughter's life long after his own had ended. He understood stone, not just as material to be broken and hauled, but as something with character, with memory, with a story written in layers of sediment and pressure and ancient chemistry. He read to his daughter every night from old newspapers he collected at the company store, tracing the words with his finger so she could follow along. And he told her about stone the way other fathers told bedtime stories. "This one was limestone," he would say, holding a pale chunk up to the lantern light. "It used to be the bottom of an ocean. Can you imagine that, Lily? We are standing on what used to be the sea. And this one, see the color that is iron oxide. That means this rock spent 1,000,000 years near water that carried rust from somewhere far away. Every stone has a journey, Lily. You just have to know how to read it." Lily inherited his silence, his sharp eyes, his way of watching before speaking. She kept a white quartz pebble he had given her, smooth and cool, which he said would sing if you held it to your ear on a quiet night. She believed him. She still believed him on the morning they told her he was dead. The collapse happened on a Tuesday. The shift had been routine. Thomas and his crew were working a new drift on the 3rd level, following a vein of copper sulfide that the company geologist said would yield big. The timbers were old. Thomas had told the foreman twice that week that the supports needed replacing. The foreman had noted the request and filed it in the same drawer where all inconvenient truths were filed, the one that was never opened again. At 10 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, a support timber cracked without warning 60 feet below the surface, and 30 tons of rock and earth came down on 3 men in the space of a single breath. The sound reached the surface as a dull thump, like a door closing far away. It took 4 days to dig out the bodies. Clara was not allowed to see her husband. The foreman said there was nothing left to see. That foreman was Silas Brennan, a man of 50 with a face like scraped leather and 3 missing fingers on his left hand blown off in a blasting accident years before. The injury had purchased him a desk and a title. He no longer went underground. He sent other men instead, and he recorded their fates in a ledger with the same detachment he used for equipment depreciation. Brennan was not evil in the way of fairy tales. He was afraid. Afraid of losing his position, afraid of the mine owners back east, whose letters arrived like verdicts, afraid of becoming once again the man who descended into the dark each morning. His fear made him precise and cold, and precision and coldness applied to human beings can look very much like cruelty. Brennan had a routine for death. He had performed it 11 times in his 4 years as foreman. He would visit the widow on the same day the body was recovered, deliver a company-issued letter of condolence that contained exactly 43 words and no specific details, and inform her of the timeline for vacating company housing. The timeline was always 72 hours. The letter was always the same. The widows were always different, but Brennan had trained himself not to notice. 6 weeks after the collapse, Clara walked up the hill to the mine office to collect her husband's final wages. She wore her only good dress, washed and pressed, because she believed that dignity was a kind of armor. Lily waited outside on a wooden bench holding her quartz pebble, watching ants cross the dusty step. Brennan sat behind his desk. His 3-fingered hand rested on a stack of documents. He did not stand when Clara entered. He did not offer her the chair. The company covered the funeral expenses, he said, not looking up. $47. That constitutes Mr. Hargrove's final compensation. Clara felt the number land in her chest like a stone. $47. That was what they charged to put Thomas in the ground. That was the price of his entire death. She asked about additional compensation. Brennan looked up for the first time. His eyes were the color of creek water in November. Compensation for what, Mrs. Hargrove? Your husband signed a contract. Mining carries risk. Everyone knows this. She asked if she could remain in the company house through the winter. Just 4 months. Just long enough to find somewhere else. Brennan shook his head. 72 hours. The company needs the house for men who can work. Men who can work. Clara heard those words and felt something ignite behind her tibs. A small hot thing that was not grief and not fear, but something harder and more lasting. She did not argue. She did not beg. She picked up the eviction notice, folded it once, and walked out of the office into the bright, indifferent sun. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Clara sat at the kitchen table in the company house for the last time and counted her money. $7. 13 years in America, 3 years in Elhorn, a husband dead under stone, and she had $7 to show for all of it. She understood the system as with a clarity that arrived too late to save Thomas, but just in time to save herself. The company town was a trap designed to look like a life. Workers were paid in scrip, a currency accepted only at the company store, where prices ran double what they cost in town. Converting scrip to real money cost 40 cents on the dollar. Leaving required settling all debts first. Thomas had worked 3 years and still owed the company. His death did not erase the debt. It simply transferred it to Clara, and now they wanted the house back too. Clara sat at the table and looked around the house that had been her home for 3 years. The walls Thomas had whitewashed every spring to keep the place bright. The shelf he had built for Lily's school reader and the small collection of interesting rocks she kept arranged by color. The wooden spoon he had carved as a wedding gift because he could not afford silver worn smooth by 1,000 meals. She could not take the shelf. She could not take the whitewash. But she took the spoon, and she took the rocks, and she took the one thing no company ledger could claim, the memory of a man who understood stone and loved his daughter and died because a timber was not replaced when it should have been. On the night before they left, a quiet knock came at the back door. Clara opened it to find Doris Pruitt standing in the dark, the wife of the assistant foreman, a nervous woman who carried fear the way other women carried handkerchiefs, always close, always visible. Doris held a small bundle, 2 loaves of bread, a sack of cornmeal, a box of matches, and something else. A hand-drawn map of the hills southwest of Townsend. A red ink mark showed a spot on the map. There is an abandoned homestead here. Doris whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows behind her. The family left 3 years ago. There is a well and a root cellar. She pushed the bundle into Clara's hands, turned, and disappeared into the night without another word. Clara never saw her again, but that map drawn in haste by a frightened woman would change everything that followed. They left Elkhorn at dawn on the third morning. Clara carried the small trunk with their clothes and the wool blanket, the hand axe, the iron pot, and the map. Lily carried her school reader in a small pack on her back along with the quartz pebble and one other thing Clara did not know about. A folded piece of paper, the funeral invoice for $47, which Lily had taken from her mother's table the night before. The girl could not read all the words on it, but she recognized the number. She kept it the way a soldier keeps a bullet casing from the battle that almost killed him, as evidence, as a reminder, as something she did not yet understand, but could not let go. Clara avoided the main road. A woman traveling alone with a child and no clear destination risked being reported to the county, and the county had the authority to remove children from parents deemed unfit. Clara was not unfit. She was poor. In 1886, the law did not always see the difference. They followed cattle trails through dry grass and along shallow creeks. The August sun hammered down on them without mercy, and the dust rose in small clouds with every step coating their clothes and their skin until they looked like they were made of the same brown earth they walked upon. Lily's shoes wore thin by noon. Clara tore a strip from her hem and wrapped it around her daughter's feet. They did not speak much. There was a kind of communication between them that did not require words, a rhythm of walking, of stopping to drink, of sharing the bread Doris had given them, that said everything about trust and endurance without a single sentence being spoken. The first night they slept beneath a large cottonwood tree beside a creek that had shrunk to a trickle in the summer heat. Clara did not dare light a fire. Lily curled into her mother's body, shivering despite the warm evening, because the shivering was not from cold, but from the accumulated shock of everything that had happened in the past 6 weeks. When Clara thought the girl was asleep, a small voice rose in the dark. "Mama, does Papa know where we are?" Clara was quiet for a long time. The stars were thick and cold overhead. A coyote called somewhere far away, and another answered. "Papa always knew where the best stone was," Clara finally said. "Maybe he is leading us there now." Lily squeezed the quartz pebble in her hand and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing steadied, and Clara lay awake watching the stars move and feeling the weight of her daughter against her ribs and wondering if she was leading them toward salvation or toward a slower, lonelier death than the one Brennan had predicted. From the window of the company boarding house back in Elkhorn, a young man watched them leave that morning. Owen Slade, 22 years old, a miner who had stood beside Thomas Hargrove on the day the timbers broke. Owen had survived because he stepped half a pace to the right. Half a pace. Thomas had not. Owen never told anyone about that half pace, but it ate at him the way water eats at limestone, slowly and visibly, until the whole structure is hollow. He stood at the window and watched Clara and Lily grow smaller against the brown hills. He did not call out. He did not follow. But his hands hanging at his sides trembled with something that was not cold. On the second day following Doris's map, Clara and Lily reached the limestone hills southwest of Townsend. The landscape shifted as if they had crossed an invisible border into different country. The flat grasslands gave way to rolling terrain, pale gray outcrops of exposed limestone jutting from the hillsides like the bones of the earth breaking through skin. The wind was stronger here, unblocked by trees carrying the smell of dust and distance and the first faint edge of autumn. They found the abandoned homestead where Doris had marked it. Calling it a homestead was generous. It was a ruin, a leaning well that still produced water when Clara lowered the bucket, the rope frayed but holding. A sod house collapsed entirely, grass and wildflowers growing from the rubble, as if the earth were slowly digesting the structure back into itself. And dug into the hillside, half hidden by scrub oak and sumac, a root cellar. The wooden door had rotted away. The roof, made of logs and earth, had caved in on one side, filling the interior with dirt, dead leaves, and the smell of years gone wrong. It was roughly 10 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with a low ceiling that forced Clara to duck. The walls were natural limestone, smooth in some places, jagged in others, streaked with mineral stains and shades of rust and cream. Lily stood at the mouth of the cellar and looked down into the dim interior. "Mama, are we going to sleep here?" Clara did not answer immediately. She stood looking at the hole in the hillside, and what she saw was not a ruin. What she saw was a memory. A house built into a hillside on the coast of northern Norway, where her grandmother, the woman Clara called Bestamore, had lived for 40 years. Half underground, thick walls of earth and stone, a turf roof that vanished under snow each winter. And inside warm, always warm, warmer than any timber cabin in the village. Clara had been born in a fishing village on the northern coast of Norway, where the winters lasted 8 months and the sun disappeared entirely for weeks at a time. Her mother died when Clara was 6, and her father, a fisherman, who understood the sea but not children, sent her to live with Bestamore in the hills above the village. Bestamore's house was ancient, built into the slope the way a badger builds its den, with walls of stacked stone and packed earth, so thick that you could not hear the wind even when it screamed across the fjord at speeds that tore the roofs off conventional houses. The floor was hard-packed earth covered with pine boughs that Bestamore changed every month. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man had to stoop, and the air inside was always the same temperature winter or summer, cool in July and warm in January, as if the house existed in its own private season. Clara had grown up in that house during visits that lasted whole winters. She remembered pressing her ear to the earthen floor as a child, convinced she could hear the ground breathing. Bestamore would laugh and say, "The earth keeps its own warmth, child. It does not forget the summer." They called it Jorda Puster, the breath of the earth. Clara had carried that memory across an ocean through 13 years of American life, through marriage and motherhood and the slow grinding of poverty, and she had nearly forgotten it. Nearly. But standing at the mouth of a broken root cellar in Montana with $7 and a 9-year-old daughter and nothing else in the world, the memory rose up through her like groundwater, finding its level unstoppable and clear. She climbed down into the cellar the next morning, intending only to pull out the rotten timbers for firewood. Every scrap of wood mattered now. But when she reached the bottom and stood still, she felt it. The air was different. Above ground, the morning wind cut through her dress like it meant to reach bone. Down here, the cold softened. The air was not warm, but it was steady, neither rising nor falling, a constant that had nothing to do with the sky or the season. Clara pressed her hand against the limestone wall. Warm, faintly, undeniably warm. She remembered what Thomas used to say about stone. Limestone holds heat better than granite. It breathes slow. And she heard Bestamore again, distant and clear. The earth does not forget the summer. It keeps the warmth in its belly all through winter. Clara stood in the cellar with her hand on the stone and cried for the first time since Thomas died. Not from despair, from recognition. She saw a path, faint, nearly impossible, half mad, but a path. She did the arithmetic standing right there in the dirt. Outside, a Montana winter could push temperatures to 40 below zero or worse. Building a log cabin required 5 to 6 cords of firewood just for heating, plus construction timber. A strong man needed 2 to 3 months to fell that much wood. Clara did not have the strength, the time, or the nearby forest. But underground, at a depth of 5 or 6 feet, the earth maintained a stable temperature of roughly 50 degrees year-round. If she could expand this cellar build, proper walls, create ventilation and drainage, and add a small stove, she would only need to raise the temperature 15 or 20 degrees, not 90. The wood required would drop to a fifth of what a surface cabin demanded. That was the difference between possible and impossible. It was madness. It was hope. And for a woman with $6 remaining and a child to protect, hope mattered more than sense. She thought about what Bestamore would say if she could see her granddaughter now standing in a broken cellar in a country Bestamore had never visited, holding a plan in her head that most people would call insane. Bestamore had been a practical woman. She did not believe in miracles, but she believed in the earth, which was perhaps the same thing expressed differently. She had survived 4 winters without a husband after Clara's grandfather died at sea, feeding herself and 3 children from a garden that grew in soil so thin you could see the rock beneath it. She had told Clara once, while they sat by the fire in the underground house, that the secret to survival was not strength or cleverness, but stubbornness. "The world will try to convince you that you are already dead," Bestamore said in her low, rough voice. "Your job is to refuse to believe it." Clara had not thought about those words in years. Now they returned with the force of a physical blow, and she gripped the edge of the cellar wall and steadied herself against the wave of memory and loss and determination that crashed through her. Bestamore had been dead for 15 years. Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks. But the earth was still breathing, and Clara was still standing, and the plan forming in her mind was not brilliant, but it was possible, and possible was enough. She climbed out of the cellar and looked at the sun rising over the limestone hills. She made her decision. She would dig. She would shape the hillside itself into shelter. And she would trust the earth more than she trusted the men who had promised her husband safety and delivered him a grave. She told Lily that evening, "We are not going to build a house. We are going to dig one." Lily looked at the dark mouth of the cellar, then back at her mother. "Like a gopher," she said. Clara almost laughed. It was the first time in weeks anything had come close. "Like Bestemore," she said. "Like your great-grandmother's house in Norway." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Papa would have liked that. He always said the best things are underground." Clara looked at her daughter and felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking apart, but breaking open the way a seed cracks when it decides to grow. 3 days later, a rider appeared on the ridge above the cellar. Henry Dahl, a rancher of 60 years, sat motionless on his horse and looked down at the woman and the child crouched beside a hole in the hillside, eating thin cornmeal mush over a small fire. Henry Dahl had a homestead 8 miles east. He lived alone. He had lived alone since the winter of 1879 when a blizzard killed his wife Martha and their twin boys, both 7 months old. He had buried them under a cottonwood on the hill behind his house, and every week for 7 years he rode up there and sat with them in silence. He did not talk to people unless necessity demanded it. He bought supplies in Townsend once a month, paid in baggage, nodded, and left. People called him Old Dahl, though he was not yet old. Grief had simply worn him into the shape of an old man before his time. He had been a different man once. In the years before the blizzard, Henry Dahl had been known as the best horseman in Broadwater County, a man who laughed easily, danced badly but enthusiastically, and could talk the ears off a fence post after 2 glasses of whiskey. Martha had loved that version of him. She used to say he had enough joy for 3 people, which was convenient because they were about to become a family of 4. The twins came in June of 1879, 2 boys small but healthy with their father's broad foreheads and their mother's dark eyes. Henry built a cradle big enough for both of them and rocked it with his boot while he read the newspaper aloud because he believed that babies should hear language from the very beginning, even if they could not understand it yet. The blizzard came in November, 6 days before Thanksgiving. It arrived without the usual warning signs, no dropping barometer, no ring around the moon. 1 hour the sky was clear. The next the world was white and screaming. Henry was in the barn when it hit. He could not see the house, though it was 60 feet away. He tied a rope to the barn door and followed it by feel, but the rope was not long enough. He had to cross 10 feet of open ground with no guide, and those 10 feet took him 20 minutes crawling on his hands and knees, the wind pushing him sideways with a force that felt intentional, malicious, alive. He found the house. He found Martha on the floor by the stove, both babies in her arms, all 3 of them already cold. The fire had gone out. The door had blown open. The temperature inside the house was the same as outside, 28 below zero. Henry closed the door. He built a fire. He sat on the floor beside his family and held them until morning, and by the time the sun rose, something inside him had frozen that would never fully thaw. Now he watched Clara and Lily for a while without dismounting. He watched the way Clara spooned the mush into Lily's bowl first, the way Lily pushed the last bite back toward her mother, the way both of them pretended not to be hungry. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He had seen it before in the mirror in the faces of settlers who did not survive their first winter, in the pale, still features of his own wife, laid out on the cabin floor with a dead infant in each arm. He dismounted and walked to the edge of the cellar. His voice was rough as split pine. His eyes moved from Clara to Lily and back again. And something shifted behind them, a recognition that he tried to suppress but could not quite extinguish. He had seen women and children before in this kind of situation. He had learned to look away because looking meant caring and caring meant the possibility of loss. And he had used up his entire lifetime supply of loss in a single November night 7 years ago. You cannot stay here. A woman cannot cut enough timber. 5 cords at least, 6 to be safe. Clara looked at him. She did not argue. She did not explain her plan. She simply met his gaze with the steady patience of someone who has already heard the worst and decided to keep going anyway. Henry leaned closer. "You will freeze in this hole, and you will take your daughter with you." He mounted his horse, turned away, and rode off without looking back. He did not offer help. He did not ask if she needed anything. He had learned long ago that hope was the most dangerous thing you could give a person in Montana because winter always collected on promises the sun made in September. Lily watched him disappear over the ridge. Her pale blue eyes, her father's eyes, tracked him until there was nothing left to see. "Mama," she whispered, "is he right?" Clara looked into the cellar, the dark, the broken beams, the cool breath rising from the earth. "I do not know," she said, But that night, as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient silence, Clara pressed her hand against the limestone and felt the warmth that lived below the frost, steady and patient and ungoverned by any man. And the thought that had been growing in her since she first climbed down into the cellar spread its roots a little deeper. If the earth could offer even a fraction of its heat, if she could capture it, shape it, protect her daughter with it, then maybe the impossible winter ahead was not impossible after all. She picked up the hand axe at dawn and began to dig, and she did not stop. For 14 days, Clara Hargrove worked from first light until she could no longer see her hands in front of her face. She swung the pick into limestone and clay. She hauled stone, one piece at a time, each heavier than the last. She dragged rocks across the prairie using a canvas sheet, her boots filling with dirt, her shoulders burning, her vision going white at the edges when she stood up too fast. The work had a rhythm to it that she learned to respect. You could not rush limestone. It broke along its own lines, following fractures that were older than any living thing. And if you tried to force it, it shattered into useless gravel. Clara learned to read the stone the way Thomas had described, tapping it with the axe head and listening for the ring. A clear, bright tone meant the stone was sound and could be used for wall construction. A dull, flat sound meant internal fractures, weakness that would let cold seep through in January. She rejected more stones than she kept, and the rejected pile grew into a mound that she would later use for the drainage channel lining. The cellar expanded slowly but deliberately. Clara dug deeper into the hillside, following the natural slope of the limestone bedrock, carving the space wider at the back, where the sleeping platform would be. She created a natural shelf along one wall by leaving a ridge of stone, uncut, a shelf that would hold their small collection of supplies: the pot, the matches, the dwindling sack of cornmeal. She dug the drainage channel first before raising the walls because she understood that water was a more immediate enemy than cold. A flooded cellar in October would end everything before winter even arrived. She ate twice a day, cornmeal mush in the morning, thin and watery, heated over a small fire. The same in the evening, sometimes with wild onions she found growing near the creek or berries from the scrub bushes on the hillside. Her body consumed itself to fuel the work-burning fat. She did not have then muscle, then something deeper, some reserve of energy that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising through her feet and into her legs and up through her spine like sap rising in a tree that refuses to die. Her body changed in ways she tracked without emotion, the way a farmer tracks weather. Blisters rose on her palms, broke, bled, and were replaced by calluses so thick she could no longer feel the grain of the axe handle. Her knees swelled from kneeling on rock. Her back seized each morning, requiring 10 minutes of slow, careful movement before she could stand straight. Her weight fell, her dress hung loose, her cheekbones rose sharp beneath her sun-darkened skin. The thumbnail on her left hand turned black after a falling slab of limestone crushed it on the 12th day. She did not cry out. She wrapped it in a strip of cloth and kept working. Lily worked beside her. At first, Clara tried to stop her. A 9-year-old should not carry stone. A 9-year-old should not mix mortar from clay and dried grass until her fingers cracked. But Lily would not stop. She carried smaller loads, sorted limestone flakes by size and thickness, with a seriousness that belonged to someone 3 times her age, and kept the fire going when Clara forgot to eat. Lily had her own way of making sense of the work. She named the stones. The largest piece of white limestone she called the gatekeeper. Her father's quartz pebble was the singer. The thin shale pieces lined up along the cellar entrance were the soldiers. She spoke to them quietly as she sorted, not in the way of a child playing make-believe, but in the way her father had taught her, as though each stone had a history and a purpose and deserved to be acknowledged. On the 12th day, when the limestone slab fell on Clara's hand and the pain roared through her like a living thing, something shifted between them that would never shift back. Clara lay on the ground, her left hand throbbing the sky, pale and cold and indifferent above her, and she wanted to quit. She felt the full weight of her smallness, her aloneness, the absurdity of one starving woman trying to dig a home out of a hillside before winter came to kill her. Then Lily knelt beside her. The girl did not ask if her mother was all right. She did not cry. She looked at Clara's injured hand, then at the half-built cellar, then back at her mother. And she said in a voice as calm and certain as stone, "Mama, I will pull the rocks. You show me where they go." Clara looked at her daughter, 9 years old, thin as a reed, eyes pale and steady, and she understood something that changed everything that followed. She was not fighting alone. Lily was not a burden to be protected. Lily was a partner. From that day on, Clara worked differently. She stopped trying to do everything herself. She began to teach how to choose stone that would sit flush against its neighbor, how to read the wind to know where to place the ventilation holes, how to mix clay mortar to the right consistency, wet enough to bond, dry enough to hold. Lily learned fast. She had her father's hands careful and precise, and her mother's stubbornness, which meant she would try a joint 6 times until it sat right without being told to. Papa taught me to listen to stone, Lily said one evening, pressing a limestone piece into the wall with both hands. Now you are teaching me to talk to the earth. Clara looked at her daughter in the fading light, the girl's face smeared with clay, her thin arms trembling with effort, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been loose and frantic for weeks. They were building this together. Whatever came next, they would face it not as a mother shielding a child, but as two people holding each other up. The cellar grew. The walls rose. And somewhere out on the high plains, the first cold front of autumn began its long march south, carrying with it the kind of winter that would enter the history books and never leave. September arrived not with a single frost, but with a slow tightening, the way a hand closes around a throat, one finger at a time. The mornings grew sharp. The grass on the hillsides turned from green to gold to brown in the space of 2 weeks, and the wind that rolled down from the northern ranges carried something new in it, a smell like iron, like the inside of a deep well, like cold itself had a scent and was announcing its approach. Clara felt it in her joints before she saw it in the sky. Her knuckles ached at dawn now. Her breath hung visible in the air until mid-morning. The calendar in her head kept its own cruel count. 6 weeks until hard frost, 8 weeks until snow that stayed, 12 weeks until the killing cold. And the cellar was not finished. The walls stood waist high. The drainage channel was cut but not lined. The ventilation shafts were marked but not dug. The roof existed only in Clara's mind, a patchwork plan of salvaged beams and creek-cut poles and birch bark and sod that she replayed each night before sleep, adjusting, correcting, trying to see the weakness before the weather found it. She needed more stone. She needed more time. She had neither. So she worked faster longer until the stars blurred overhead and Lily had to lead her by the hand to the blankets they spread each night on the ground beside the cellar entrance. It was during this stretch of desperate labor on an evening when Clara was dragging a flat stone across the prairie with a rope looped over her shoulders that Margaret Lund appeared. She came on horseback from the east, a broad-shouldered woman with sun-darkened cheeks and eyes that looked like they had been tired for years and had given up expecting rest. She sat in the saddle without moving and watched Clara work the way a person watches a river in flood, with a mixture of respect and certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Maggie Lund was 45 years old, Swedish by birth, widowed by Montana. Her husband Eric had died 4 winters earlier, not from cold or accident, but from whiskey. He had drunk himself unconscious on the road home from a saloon in Townsend and frozen to death 200 yards from their cabin door. Maggie found him the next morning, stiff as lumber, dusted with frost, his mouth still open, as if he had one last thing to say, and the cold had stolen it from him. She did not weep. She dragged his body inside, washed him, dressed him in his cleanest shirt, and dug his grave herself in frozen ground that took 3 days to break open. Since then, she had lived alone on a small homestead 6 miles east, tending a handful of cattle, mending her own fences, answering to no one. She was the kind of woman who measured people not by what they said, but by what they did when no one was looking. And she had been watching Clara Hargrove for almost a week before she finally rode in close enough to speak. "What are you building?" Maggie said. It was not really a question. It was an invitation to explain yourself, the kind of opening a judge gives a defendant before passing sentence. Clara set down the rope and straightened her back, which took several seconds and produced a sound like knuckles cracking. She explained. The warmth of the earth, the limestone in walls that would absorb and release heat like a slow heartbeat. The chimney she planned to form from clay, fired hard over days of careful burning. The drainage channel that would carry groundwater out through the slope instead of letting it pool on the floor. The ventilation shafts, 2 of them, one for smoke and one for fresh air, positioned to create a gentle cross draft without letting the wind steal the warmth. And the mathematics. The simple, terrible, beautiful mathematics that said if the earth gave you 50 degrees for free, you only needed to find 20 more. And 20 degrees was something a small stove and a careful woman could provide. Maggie listened without interruption. Her face gave away nothing. When Clara finished, Maggie said softly, "You are digging a grave." Clara nodded. Yes, but maybe a warm one. Something moved behind Maggie's eyes. She looked at Clara's hands. The split skin, the dried blood pooled beneath what was left of her nails, the swelling across both wrists that spoke of tendons pulled past their limit. Then she looked up the hill at Lily, who sat cross-legged on a flat rock, sorting limestone fragments into careful rows, her lips moving quietly as she spoke to each piece. You do not have time, Maggie said. I know. If the water seeps in, you will drown in your sleep. I have cut drainage. If the smoke does not vent, you will suffocate before morning. I have planned 2 shafts. If the roof fails under snow load, you will be buried alive. Clara paused. This was the weakness she had not solved. She needed stronger timbers than anything the collapsed sod house had offered, and the nearest real trees were miles away along the creek bottoms, too far to haul without a horse or a wagon, neither of which she possessed. I know, Clara said again. I have not solved the roof yet. Maggie stared at her for a long time. The wind moved the grass around them in slow waves. A hawk circled overhead, riding the updraft from the limestone bluffs, patient and silent. You have thought about this, Maggie said. I have thought about nothing else. Maggie turned her horse. Before riding away, she looked back over her shoulder and gave one small nod, the kind of gesture that costs nothing and means everything. If you live through November, she said, I will bring you half a smoked hog. It was the closest thing to a blessing Clara had received since leaving Elkhorn. She picked up the rope, looped it over her shoulders, and went back to dragging stone. But Maggie did not disappear. 2 weeks later, she returned without announcement, carrying a thick wool blanket rolled tight and tied behind her saddle. It had been her husband's. She dropped it beside the cellar entrance without ceremony. I do not need it, she said. He does not either. Then she left. The third visit brought a sack of potatoes and a coil of good rope. The fourth brought tools, a proper mallet, a chisel, a small iron pry bar. Each time Maggie said nothing beyond what was necessary left without waiting for thanks and rode away at the same unhurried pace. Clara understood. Maggie was not being generous. Maggie was refusing to watch another woman die in a Montana winter because she had already survived that particular kind of loneliness and knew its weight to the ounce. Over the weeks that followed, something formed between them that neither woman would have called friendship because neither woman used words that soft. It was more like the relationship between 2 trees growing on the same ridge, leaning slightly toward each other without touching, sharing the wind. Maggie began to come twice a week, then 3 times. She never helped dig. She never picked up a stone. But she watched and she commented with the precision of an engineer. The drainage needs more pitch at this section. That stone will crack when it freezes. Replace it. Your mortar is too wet. Add more grass. There was an evening in late September when Maggie stayed longer than usual. The sun was setting behind the limestone bluffs, painting the hillside in shades of amber and rust, and Clara had stopped working because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the trowel. She sat on a rock beside the cellar entrance and stared at her palms at the cracks and calluses and dry blood that had become so familiar she barely noticed them anymore. And Maggie sat down beside her without being asked, which was unusual for a woman who respected physical distance the way monks respect silence. They sat together without speaking for a long time. Lily was already asleep inside the cellar, curled on the canvas blanket with her quartz pebble clutched in one hand. The last light faded. Stars appeared. An owl called from somewhere in the distance, 2 low notes repeated at intervals, patient and unhurried. My husband used to sit like this, Maggie said, and it was the first time she had ever mentioned Eric to Clara without bitterness. After dinner on the porch, he would watch the stars come out. He was a different man at twilight, softer, more like the man I married. She paused. Then he would go inside and open the bottle, and by midnight he was someone else entirely. Clara did not know what to say, so she said nothing, and that was the right thing because Maggie did not need a response. She needed a witness. She needed someone to sit beside her and hear the truth she had carried alone for 4 years. The truth that she had loved a man who destroyed himself, and that the love and the destruction had been so thoroughly intertwined that she could not separate them even now, even after he was frozen in the ground and she had dug his grave with her own hands. You are building something, Maggie said after another long silence. I never built anything after Eric died. I only maintained. I kept the cattle alive. I kept the fences standing. I kept myself fed. But I never built. She looked at the cellar, at the walls rising from the hillside in the starlight, at the work of months made manifest in stone. You are different. Clara shook her head. I am the same as you. I am just more desperate. Maggie almost smiled. It was the closest Clara had ever seen her come to it, a slight softening around the eyes, a barely perceptible lift at one corner of her mouth. Maybe desperate is just another word for brave, Maggie said. Then she stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and walked to her horse without saying goodbye, because goodbye was a word neither of them used with the other. They simply came and went like weather, like seasons, like the earth's own breath. Lily began calling her Mrs. Lund, and Maggie, who kept her distance from most living things the way a burned hand keeps its distance from flame, began bringing hard candy for the girl. Brown sugar drops she made herself in a small pot on her wood stove. Lily rationed each one across an entire day, holding it against the inside of her cheek, while she worked and she lined up the wrappers beside the stone soldiers on the cellar ledge. Small paper sentries guarding a kingdom of dirt and rock. It was into this fragile rhythm of work and endurance that Silas Brennan rode on a morning in early September, accompanied by a company surveyor carrying a leather case of maps. Brennan had not come out of concern. He had come because a rumor reached him that the dead miner's widow was squatting on land near Townsend, living like an animal in a hole in the ground. And if that land held any mineral value, the company needed to know before she established a legal claim. Brennan was a man who understood territory the way a dog understands territory. You marked it or you lost it. He did not expect what he found. He had imagined a woman broken by reality, filthy, starving, perhaps already half mad. Instead, he found Clara Hargrove standing waist-deep in a cellar that was beginning to look like something deliberate, stacking limestone with a precision that would have impressed a mason. The walls were rising clean and plumb. The drainage channel cut along the floor was lined with shale and running clear. The two ventilation shafts were roughed in, angled to catch prevailing wind without creating a direct draft. This was not the work of a desperate woman hiding in a hole. This was construction. Brennan stood at the rim and looked down. "This land is not yours," he said. Clara did not stop working. "This land was abandoned. I am improving it. I filed a homestead claim." She had walked to Townsend the previous week to file the paperwork, a full day each way, leaving Lily in Maggie's care. The claim was clean. The surveyor checked his maps and nodded. The land fell outside the company's mineral rights. Brennan had no legal footing here, and he knew it, and knowing it made him angrier than if Clara had drawn a gun on him. He looked down into the cellar at the walls, the drainage, the beginnings of a chimney stack, and he felt something he could not name, but which sat in his stomach like undigested meat. This woman had been nothing. A line in his ledger, a number to cross out a problem solved by eviction notice. And here she was building something out of the earth itself with her bare, destroyed hands, and she was not asking his permission or his help or his forgiveness. "You are digging your own grave," he said, and his voice had an edge that was not authority but fear. "When you die out here, the company will scrape your bones out by spring." Lily appeared at the cellar's edge. She stood behind her mother and stared at the man who had sent them into the cold. She said nothing. Her silence was deliberate, in total the silence of a child who has learned that some adults do not deserve the effort of speech. Inside her pack, her fingers closed around the folded funeral invoice. $47. She did not know why she kept it. She only knew that every time she saw Brennan, the paper felt hot in her hand. Clara held his gaze without blinking. He was a bigger person, a man with authority and a horse and a company behind him. But Clara had faced worse than Silas Brennan. She had faced the dark of early mornings alone, the cold of nights without fire, the silence of a bed where her husband no longer slept. Those things were harder than one frightened man on a hillside. She did not step back. Brennan turned away. "You cannot win," he said over his shoulder, already walking toward his horse. "I do not need to win," Clara said quietly. "I only need to survive." He rode off without responding, but the set of his shoulders was different than when he had arrived. Tighter, smaller. He looked like a man who had come to collect a debt and discovered the borrower no longer recognized his currency. The confrontation changed the story in a way that neither of them fully understood at the time. Before Brennan came, Clara was surviving. After he left, she was resisting. The cellar was no longer just shelter. It was proof that a person could exist outside the system that had used her husband up and thrown her away, and that proof frightened Brennan more than any legal challenge could. The days shortened. The work continued. October brought frost that stayed past noon and the first light snow that did not melt by evening. Clara's race against winter entered its final stretch. The walls reached their full height. She lined the interior face with the thickest limestone she could find, knowing that mass was everything. Thick stone absorbed heat during the day from the stove and released it slowly through the night like a living thing exhaling warmth. She packed clay and dried grass between the stones, sealing every crack, every gap where cold might find a way in. The roof went up over 12 desperate days in late October. Salvaged beams from the collapsed sod house formed the main support, supplemented by poles Clara and Lily cut from the creek bottoms 3 miles south, dragging them back one at a time across the prairie. Birch bark layered over the poles created a waterproof membrane. Over that, Clara laid 20 centimeters of sod cut from the hillside in heavy blocks that made her arms shake and her vision dim. The finished roof was ugly, uneven, patched in places with whatever she could find. But it was solid, and when the first real snow fell on it, the snow would add another layer of insulation, the way it had on Bestemor's house in Norway, turning the entire structure into a mound of earth indistinguishable from the hillside around it. Then came the stove, and with the stove came Owen Slade. He appeared on a mid-October afternoon walking from the direction of Elhorn, no horse carrying a heavy sack on his back that bent him nearly double. Clara recognized him at once and felt her body go rigid. Owen Slade, 22 years old, the last person to stand beside Thomas before the world fell on him. Owen did not look at her directly. He set the sack down in front of the cellar entrance and stood there with his head lowered, his thin frame trembling, though the afternoon was not particularly cold. Inside the sack was a small cast-iron stove, a potbelly model, the kind used in mining camp cabins. Old but intact, no cracks, no rust holes. Clara stared at it and felt something catch in her throat. She knew this stove. Thomas had brought it home once to repair a cracked seam, soldering it shut with tin and patience. She could see the solder line now, a thin silver ridge running along the lower belly of the stove like a scar. It was Thomas's. Owen said, his voice barely above a whisper. In the changing room at the mine. He fixed it last spring. After he died, the company bought a new one. They were going to throw this out. I kept it. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the grass moving on the hillside above them. Why, she said, and the question was not about the stove. Owen's face crumpled. He was young enough that his emotions still showed on his skin the way weather shows on water, every shift visible, nothing hidden. Tears cut through the dust on his cheeks. I was standing next to him when the timbers broke, right next to him, but I stepped to the right, half a step, just half a step, and Thomas did not. He was crying without sound, now his shoulders shaking, his hands hanging useless at his sides. Half a step, the distance between living and dying measured in inches in the random placement of a boot on loose ground, and the difference between a man who went home to his daughter and a man who did not go home at all. Clara did not know what to say. She stood in front of the cellar she had dug with her own bleeding hands, looking at this boy who carried her husband's death on his back as surely as he had carried the stove, and she felt anger rise in her chest. Not at Owen, at the mine, at the system, at the blind mechanical cruelty of a universe that decided who lived and who died based on half a step. Lily came out of the cellar. She looked at Owen, at the stove, at her mother's face. Then she walked to the sack, knelt down, and ran her fingers along the iron surface until she found the solder line, her father's repair. The last thing his hands had fixed. Papa fixed this, she said, not a question. Yes, Owen whispered. Lily looked at the stove for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother. Mama, this fits where I cleared the space. The words broke something open. Clara nodded. Let him help carry it in, she said. They set the stove together, the three of them, fitting it into the alcove Lily had prepared along the south wall of the cellar. The chimney pipe connected to the ventilation shaft Clara had dug weeks before, and it fit better than she had any right to expect, as though the cellar had been waiting for this particular stove, this particular piece of iron that still carried the mark of a dead man's hands. Owen did not stay. He helped with the installation, checked the chimney draw by lighting a small test fire and watching the smoke rise clean and straight through the shaft, and then stood at the entrance as if waiting for permission to leave. His eyes were red and his face was streaked with the tracks of tears through dust, and he looked like a man who had been carrying a boulder on his back for 6 weeks and had just set it down and did not know how to stand without the weight. I am sorry, he said. I know it is not enough. Clara looked at him. He was thin and haunted and young and alive, and Thomas was none of those things anymore. She thought about the half step. She thought about the timber that should have been replaced and was not, and the foreman who filed the request in the drawer that was never opened, and the system that had decided a piece of wood was not worth the cost of a man's life. Owen had not made that decision. Owen had simply been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on which man you were talking about. Nothing is enough, she said, but the stove helps. That was all the forgiveness she had in her. It was not complete forgiveness, because complete forgiveness requires time and distance and the slow softening that comes from understanding that the universe does not distribute its cruelties with intention. But it was a beginning. It was a door left slightly ajar instead of locked, and Owen took it and left walking back the way he had come, his shadow long in the afternoon light. He did not turn around, but his step was lighter almost imperceptibly, as if the weight of the stove he had carried for 3 days had been replaced by something else, something that was still heavy, but at least had the shape of purpose. Clara watched him go and thought about Thomas. She thought about the wooden spoon in the trunk and the solder line on the stove and the quartz pebble in Lily's pocket, and how a man who was dead could still be present in the objects he had touched, and the skills he had passed to his daughter, and the love he had left behind, like heat stored in stone, slowly releasing, never quite exhausted. That evening, Clara built the first fire in the iron stove. She crumpled dried grass into the belly, stacked small kindling over it, and struck a match. The flame caught. Smoke rose through the chimney pipe, through the clay shaft, and out into the October sky. Clean. No backflow, no leak. The system worked. She stood in the center of the cellar and watched the stove glow. She placed her hand on the limestone wall. The stone was already warming, pulling heat from the stove and holding it the way cupped hands hold water, gently, carefully, as if it understood the value of what it had been given. The thermometer she had bought in Townsend for 50 cents, the only luxury she had allowed herself, read 58 degrees. Outside, the evening air was 28. Lily lay on the raised stone platform at the back of the cellar, wrapped in Maggie's wool blanket, her head resting on the folded canvas that served as a pillow. For the first time in weeks, she was not shivering. Her breathing was slow and even. Her hand hung over the edge of the platform, fingers curled loosely around the quartz pebble. Clara watched her daughter sleep and felt something move in her chest that she had not felt since Thomas died. A fragile, terrifying, necessary thing. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence. Just the smallest opening in the wall of fear she had lived behind for months, a crack of light suggesting that the darkness might not be permanent. She dared to think one thought. Maybe we will live. The first real blizzard struck in mid-November. It came from the northwest like a living thing, howling across the limestone hills with a fury that shook the earth above the cellar and sent snow hissing against every surface. The temperature plunged to 22 below zero in a single night. Clara sealed the entrance with the wool blanket, packing dried grass around the edges. She fed the stove steadily, carefully rationing her wood supply, with the precision of a woman who understood that each log was a unit of time and she could not afford to waste a single hour. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the thermometer held at 58 degrees. Clara checked it 3 times during the night, unable to believe the number. 58, 57, 58, steady. The limestone walls radiated heat evenly. The earth below and around them maintained its 50-degree foundation. The stove needed only to add a few degrees more. The blanket door and the entrance tunnel trapped a pocket of still air that acted as a buffer between the fury outside and the calm within. Lily woke in the darkest part of the night when the wind outside reached its peak, and the sound was like a freight train running inches above their heads. "Mama," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only wonder. Clara listened. "The wind is out there," she said, "not in here." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mama, our house is warmer than the one in Elhorn." And she was right. The thin pine company house, with its gaps and its drafts, had never held 58 degrees during a blizzard. Not once. When the storm passed, Maggie rode over to check on them. She ducked through the entrance tunnel, stood upright inside the cellar, and stopped moving. The warmth hit her like stepping into a different season. She closed her eyes. She stood very still while the heat soaked into her bones, into the deep cold places that her surface cabin had not been able to reach in 4 winters of solitary endurance. She opened her eyes and looked at the thermometer. 58 degrees. She looked at Clara. "You did it," she said, 2 words that carried the weight of everything she had doubted and everything she now believed. And true to her promise, Maggie returned the next day with half a smoked hog, a sack of potatoes, a jar of salt, and a book for Lily. An old copy of a geology primer, its spine cracked, its pages yellow. For the girl, Maggie said, winter is long. The cellar had passed its first test. But Clara knew and Maggie knew, and the old ranchers in Townsend knew that a November blizzard was a handshake from winter. The real grip had not yet closed. Across the Great Plains from Montana to Texas, the autumn of 1886 had already killed more cattle than anyone could count. The grass had been poor that summer, thin and dry, and the herds went into winter weak and unprepared. By December, ranchers were finding dead steers frozen upright in draws and gullies, their eyes open, their legs locked in the position of walking, as if death had come so fast they did not have time to fall. They called what followed the Great Die-Up. Millions of cattle perished across the open range. Ranchers who had counted their wealth in thousands of head found themselves bankrupt by spring. The era of open-range cattle ranching, the vast herds moving freely across unfenced grassland, ended that winter and never returned. But the cattle were not the only casualties. People died too. Children froze on the way to school. Families ran out of wood and burned their furniture, their doors, their floorboards, and that sat in the hollow shells of their homes and waited for the end. Temperatures in parts of Montana fell to 60 below zero. Blizzard winds reached 60 miles an hour, creating whiteout conditions where a person could become lost 10 feet from their own door and die before finding it again. Clara did not know any of this yet. She did not know that the winter of 1886 to 1887 would enter the history books as one of the most devastating in American memory. She only knew that her daughter was warm, that she had enough potatoes and smoked pork for 2 months if she rationed carefully, and that every day she and Lily woke up alive was a day stolen from the cold. December passed in a rhythm of quiet survival. Clara maintained the stove-cooked thin soups and cornmeal mush, melted snow for water, and kept the drainage channel clear. Lily read the geology book Maggie had given her, sounding out the longer words with her finger, and she began writing on the cellar walls with charcoal sticks. She wrote the names of her stones. She wrote the date each morning in small, neat letters near the entrance. She wrote short stories about the gatekeeper and the soldiers and the singer, and the limestone wall became a kind of journal, a record of their days written in a child's hand on the bones of an ancient sea. The days blurred into each other with a sameness that could have been maddening, but instead became a kind of peace. Clara woke before dawn, relit the stove from the banked coals of the night before in heated water. Lily woke to the sound of the stove door opening and closing, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as her father's footsteps had once been. They ate breakfast in the warm amber light of the stove cornmeal mush, with a sliver of salt pork so small it was more flavor than substance. Then Clara checked the entrance tunnel, cleared any snow that had drifted in, inspected the ventilation shafts for ice blockage, and examined the drainage channel for signs of freezing. These tasks were performed with the regularity of ritual, and they gave the days a structure that kept despair at a distance. Lily's writings on the wall grew more elaborate as December progressed. She began drawing maps, imaginary territories where the stones she had named ruled over kingdoms of dirt and clay. The gatekeeper guarded the entrance to a vast underground city. The soldiers patrolled the borders. The singer lived in a crystal palace at the center and sang songs that kept the earth warm. It was a child's fantasy, but it was also a survival mechanism, a way of imposing meaning and order on a situation that was terrifying in its simplicity. They were two people in a hole in the ground, waiting for winter to decide whether they would live or die. And Lily needed the story the way she needed the warmth to remind herself that the world still contained wonder even when it seemed determined to contain only cold. Clara watched her daughter create this world of stone and story, and she understood that Lily was not merely enduring the winter. She was making something of it. The child who had left Elhorn silent and frightened was becoming someone else, someone forged by circumstance into a version of herself that was both harder and more beautiful than anything Clara had imagined. Lily had her father's love of stone and her mother's refusal to quit, and the combination of those two qualities, imagination and stubbornness, was producing something remarkable in the dim, warm chamber of the cellar. On Christmas Day, Clara used the last of the sugar Doris Pruitt had hidden in the cornmeal sack, a handful that had settled to the bottom, to make a small batch of sweetened mush. It was the closest thing to a celebration they could manage. Lily ate her portion slowly, savoring each bite, And when she finished, she looked at her mother with eyes that held no self-pity and no complaint and said, "This is the best Christmas, Mama, because we built our own house." Clara could not speak for a long time after that. They were surviving. The cellar held. The earth breathed its steady warmth beneath them. But out on the plains, in the towns, and on the ranches, the worst was gathering itself for one final assault. And when it came, it would test everything Clara had built, everything she believed, in the life of the one person she could not afford to lose. January arrived with a silence that was worse than any wind. The sky turned a color Clara had never seen before. Not gray, not white, but a pale yellow that reminded her of old bone, as if the atmosphere itself were sick with what it was about to deliver. The cold deepened in a way that felt personal, deliberate, as though winter had been watching Clara's little cellar with growing irritation and had finally decided to stop playing. For the first 10 days of the new year, the temperature never climbed above zero. Clara rationed wood with the care of a woman counting the beats of her own heart. 3 logs in the morning to bring the cellar from its resting 51 degrees up to 58. 2 logs at midday, 2 more before sleep. The stove consumed each offering with a quiet hunger that never seemed satisfied, and the wood pile beside the entrance shrank at a pace that kept Clara awake long after Lily's breathing had steadied into sleep. Lily had changed during the winter months. Not in the ways a child usually changes, not taller or rounder or louder, but in a direction that was harder to name. She had become still in the way her father had been, still, watchful, patient, capable of sitting for an hour without moving while she studied the frost patterns on the stone near the ventilation shaft. She read the geology book Maggie had given her so many times that the spine finally separated, and Clara had to bind it with a strip of leather. Lily could name 12 types of sedimentary rock by January. She understood in her own way that the limestone surrounding them had once been the floor of a shallow sea built from the compressed bodies of creatures that had lived and died millions of years before any human walked the earth. The idea fascinated her. She told Clara one evening while they ate thin potato soup by the glow of the stove that the cellar walls were made of ghosts. "What kind of ghost?" Clara asked. "The good kind," Lily said. "The kind that keep you warm." Clara looked at her daughter and saw Thomas so clearly it hurt. The same quiet certainty, the same way of finding wonder in stone. But there was something else in Lily too. Something Clara recognized from herself. A hardness that had not been there in August. A watchfulness that belonged to a person who had learned too young that the world could take everything from you in the space of a single breath. Lily no longer asked when they would have a real house. She no longer asked about school or friends or the life they had left behind in Elhorn. She had narrowed her world to the dimensions of the cellar, the woodpile, the stove, the stones, and her mother. Everything else had been released, dropped overboard like weight from a sinking boat, and what remained was a child stripped down to her essential self, tough and bright and more fragile than she appeared. Clara worried about this. She worried that survival was costing her daughter something that could not be measured in degrees or cords of wood. But she did not have the luxury of worrying for long, because on the morning of January 7th, Lily coughed. The sound hit Clara with a force that was entirely out of proportion to its volume. She was crouched by the stove, feeding the morning's first logs into the belly, and the cough came from the sleeping platform behind her, small and dry and ordinary, and Clara's hands stopped moving, as if they had been seized by an invisible grip. She knew the sound. She knew what it meant. She had heard it before in the village in Norway, in the weeks before the Anderson boys stopped breathing in the terrible silence that followed, when their mother's keening filled the valley and did not stop for 3 days. Clara stood very still. She did not turn around immediately. She needed a moment to compose the expression on her face because Lily was watching her constantly, now reading her mother's emotions the way Clara read stone, looking for cracks, for signs of weakness that might mean the structure was about to fail. Clara could not let her daughter see fear. Fear was contagious in a confined space, and once it took hold, it consumed oxygen faster than fire. She turned around with a calm she did not feel and placed her hand on Lily's forehead. "Cool, no fever yet, just a cough. Children cough in winter. It does not always mean something." But the voice in Clara's head that had kept her alive since August, the voice that calculated and planned and refused to look away from hard truths, that voice said, "Pay attention. Watch. Do not sleep." Lily noticed her mother's hand on her forehead and frowned. "I am fine, Mama. It was just dust." She pointed at the ventilation shaft where a fine powder of limestone grit sometimes filtered down when the wind shifted. "See? Dust. Clara nodded and smiled and removed her hand and went back to the stove, and she held onto the word dust, the way a drowning person holds onto a piece of drifting wood, knowing it was not enough to save her, but unable to let go. By afternoon, the cough had deepened. It came from lower in Lily's chest, now a wet, heavy sound that seemed to require her entire body to produce. She sat on the sleeping platform with her knees pulled to her chest, the geology book open in her lap, but she was not reading. Her eyes had a glassy, unfocused look that Clara recognized with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. By nightfall, Lily was shivering despite the 58-degree air. Her forehead burned under Clara's palm. Her cheeks flushed dark red, and her breathing acquired a new sound, a faint crackling at the bottom of each inhale as if something inside her chest were slowly tearing. Clara had seen this before. In Norway as a child, she had watched two boys from the neighboring farm die of pneumonia in the same week. It started the same way. A cough, a fever, the crackling breath, and then the silence that followed when the body could no longer fight. She had no medicine. She had no doctor. The nearest physician was in Townsend, 15 miles south, and the temperature outside was 18 below zero, with wind that would freeze exposed skin in minutes. Even if she could walk that distance, she could not leave Lily alone, and she could not carry a feverish child through the dark across frozen prairie without killing them both. All she had was warm water, the wool blanket, the steady heat of the limestone walls, and her own two hands. She wrapped Lily in every piece of cloth they owned. She heated water on the stove and held the cup to her daughter's lips, coaxing small sips into a throat that did not want to swallow. She wet a strip of fabric and laid it across Lily's forehead, replacing it every few minutes as the fever stole the coolness from the cloth. And she talked. She talked because silence terrified her more than the storm, because she believed on some level deeper than reason that the sound of her voice was a rope thrown into the dark that her daughter could hold onto a line, connecting Lily to the world of the living when the pull toward the other side grew strong. She told Lily about Bestemor, about the house built into the hillside in Norway, where the walls smelled of earth and dried herbs, and the fire never went out from October to April. She told her about the whales that Bestemor claimed to have seen in the fjord, great dark shapes moving through water so cold it looked black, and how Bestemor said the whales sang to each other across distances that no human voice could cross. She told her about Thomas, how they met in Butte at a dance she had not wanted to attend, how he asked her to waltz and stepped on her feet 3 times and apologized each time with such genuine embarrassment that she fell in love, not with his grace, but with his honesty. How he carved a wooden spoon for her as a wedding gift because he could not afford silver, and how that spoon, worn smooth by years of use, was still in her trunk at the foot of the sleeping platform. Lily listened, or seemed to listen. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing came in short, shallow gasps that filled the cellar with a sound like paper being slowly crumpled. Occasionally, her hand would tighten around Clara's wrist, a small squeeze that said, "I am still here," and Clara would squeeze back and keep talking. The second day was worse. Lily stopped speaking. She lay on the platform with her eyes half open, seeing nothing, her body burning, while the world outside froze. The fever had taken her somewhere Clara could not follow, a place between sleep and waking where the boundaries of the cellar dissolved and the stone walls became something else, something Lily saw but could not describe. She murmured once about the gatekeeper. She murmured about the singer. And then she was quiet again, and the quiet was the worst sound Clara had ever heard. Clara did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the platform with her daughter's head in her lap, one hand on Lily's chest to feel each breath, the other feeding small pieces of wood into the stove at intervals she measured not by the clock, but by the rhythm of her own fear. She ate nothing. She drank hot water because she knew dehydration would take her next if she let it. And she prayed not to any god she had been taught about in the Lutheran churches of Elhorn, but to the earth itself, to the limestone and the clay, and the ancient compressed bones of sea creatures that surrounded them. Hold her. Please hold her. Do not let the cold take her from me. And then, as if the world had listened to Clara's prayer and decided to answer with annihilation, the sky opened. January 9th, 1887, a date that would be written in the histories of the Great Plains for as long as people remembered what weather could do. The morning began strangely warm, 18 degrees above zero, the mildest temperature in weeks. Settlers across Montana stepped outside, blinking in the relative softness, some without coats, some smiling for the first time in months. Children were sent to school. Ranchers rode out to check on surviving cattle. The warm spell felt like mercy. It was a trap. By noon, the northwestern horizon had turned the color of a bruise. By 1 o'clock, the wind arrived. Not gradually, not building over hours as storms usually did, but all at once, a wall of Arctic air that slammed into the plains with the force of a detonation. In the space of minutes, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, then 30. The wind screamed at speeds that tore shutters from windows and ripped roofing from barns. Snow came not from above, but from everywhere horizontal, blinding a white darkness that swallowed the world. Across the territory, children were trapped in schoolhouses. Ranchers caught in the open staggered in circles, unable to find their own fences. Families huddled in cabins and listened to the walls groan under wind that did not relent for a single second. This was the storm that history would remember, the killing storm, the one that ended an era and left its mark on every family that lived through it and many that did not. In the limestone hills, Clara heard it coming. The sound preceded the wind by almost a minute, a low roar that built from the northwest like an approaching train, growing louder, deeper, more total until it filled the world from horizon to horizon, and there was no other sound left. She had just enough time to seal the entrance with the wool blanket, pack dried grass into every gap she could reach, and check that the ventilation shafts were clear, but angled away from the prevailing wind. Then the storm hit. The impact shook dirt from the ceiling. The entrance blanket billowed inward like a sail, and Clara threw her weight against it, pressing it back into place, feeling the wind push against her with a strength that did not feel mechanical but alive, as if something enormous and furious were trying to claw its way inside. She held the blanket until the initial surge passed, then wedged a heavy stone against the base and packed more grass around the edges. Snow began to accumulate in the entrance tunnel, immediately pushed in by wind that found every crack, every imperfection, every space where Clara's construction fell short of perfect. She scooped the snow out by hand, but it came faster than she could remove it. Within an hour, the tunnel was blocked. Within 2 hours, the entrance was sealed entirely by packed snow and ice, and Clara and Lily were buried alive inside the hill. The stove burned. The thermometer read 55 degrees. Outside, the temperature was falling through numbers that belonged to a different planet. 22 below, 34 below, 46 below. Clara could not check the outside thermometer because the entrance was buried, but she did not need to. She could hear the cold in the way the wind sounded, a high, thin shriek that was no longer the voice of moving air, but the sound of the atmosphere itself being torn apart by temperatures it was not designed to carry. Lily lay on the platform, burning with fever, unaware of the storm. Her breathing had not improved. Each inhale crackled. Each exhale carried a faint moan that she did not seem to know she was making. Clara spooned warm water into her mouth and held her upright. When the coughing fits came, and between the fits, she watched the woodpile and did the arithmetic that had governed her life since August. She had enough wood for perhaps 36 hours of continuous burning. The storm showed no sign of stopping. If it lasted 2 days, she would run out. If it lasted 3, she would have been out for a full day with a sick child in a sealed cellar with no heat source except the earth itself. The decision came to her not as a flash of inspiration, but as a slow settling, the way silt settles in still water, each particle finding its place until the whole picture becomes clear. She could burn everything she had and keep the temperature at 58 for a day and a half. Or she could let the fire die now, while the walls were still warm from hours of steady heating, and find out once and for all whether the earth would hold. If it held, she could burn wood in intervals, a few hours on, a few hours off, stretching her supply across 4 or 5 days instead of 1.5. If it did not hold, the temperature would drop, and Lily, already weakened by fever, might not survive the cold. Clara looked at her daughter. Lily's face was flushed and damp. Her lips cracked, her hair matted with sweat. The quartz pebble lay in her open palm, the singer, the stone her father had given her, the stone that was supposed to sing on quiet nights. Clara looked at the stove, at the orange glow behind the iron door, at the heat shimmering above the chimney pipe. She looked at the limestone wall she had built with her own hands over 3 months of labor that had nearly killed her walls she had sealed and shaped and trusted with everything she had. She heard Bestamore's voice faint and clear, as if the old woman were standing beside her in the dark. The earth does not forget the summer. Clara opened the stove door and did not add another log. She sat back on the edge of the platform, placed her hand flat against the limestone wall, and waited. The fire burned down. The glow behind the iron door dimmed from orange to red to a deep, dull cherry that pulsed once, twice, and went dark. The cellar filled with shadow. The only light was a faint gray seepage from the ventilation shaft's starlight filtered through snow, barely enough to see the outline of her own hand. The wind screamed outside. The earth was silent. Clara watched the thermometer by the light of a single match, striking one every hour, letting it burn just long enough to read the number before the flame reached her fingers. 1 hour, 56 degrees. 2 hours, 54. 3 hours, 52. 4 hours, 51. Then it stopped. She struck another match at the 5-hour mark, 51, another at 6 hours, 51. The temperature held as if the earth had drawn a line and refused to let the cold cross it. Outside, the world was 46 below zero, or worse, a temperature at which exposed flesh freezes in less than a minute, at which trees explode from the pressure of frozen sap, at which cattle die standing and do not fall until the spring thaw loosens their joints. Inside, without fire, the earth cradled them at 51 degrees. 97 degrees of difference. The width of that margin was the distance between a grave and a home, between a mother who buried her daughter and a mother who did not, between a story that ended in January and one that continued into spring. Clara sat in the dark with her hand on the wall and wept. Not from grief, not from fear, from a gratitude so deep it had no name. A thankfulness directed not at the sky but at the ground, at the limestone that held the memory of ancient summers in its bones, at the grandmother who had known this truth before Clara was born, at the dead sea creatures whose compressed remains now radiated warmth into a cellar where a woman and her child clung to life while the world above them tried to end. Sometime before dawn, when the wind had not stopped but had shifted to a lower register, a bass note that vibrated the earth instead of tearing at it, Lily stirred. Her hand moved across the rough wool blanket, searching, and found Clara's arm. Her fingers were cooler than they had been for days. The burning had receded. The fever was breaking. "Mama," she whispered, and her voice was thin but clear, like a thread of light in a dark room. "I am here," Clara said. "I am hungry." Clara covered her mouth with both hands. She had not slept in 3 days. She had eaten almost nothing. Her body was so exhausted that the tears running down her face felt like they belonged to someone else. A woman she was watching from a great distance, a woman kneeling beside her daughter in the dark belly of the earth, alive against all reason, held by stone and clay and the stubborn warmth that lived below the frost. She lit the stove. She heated water. She made the thinnest broth from a sliver of Maggie's smoked pork and a single small potato. And she held the cup while Lily drank, and each swallow was a sound more beautiful than any music Clara had ever heard. The storm lasted 2 more days. The cold held for 16 days, beyond that 16 days of temperatures so savage that even the oldest ranchers in Montana admitted they had never seen anything like it and hoped they never would again. Trees split open in the night with sounds like gunshots. Cattle froze in herds, their bodies discovered in spring, arranged in circles, heads together as if they had been trying to share warmth in their final moments. Families across the territory lost children, lost livestock, lost everything they had built in years of hard labor, lost to a winter that did not discriminate between the prepared and the careless, the wealthy and the poor. But in the limestone hills southwest of Townsend, in a cellar dug by hand into the earth by a woman who had started with $7 and a child, and nothing else, the temperature held above 55 degrees with the stove burning and 51 without it. Clara burned wood in intervals, 3 hours on, 3 hours off, and her supply lasted through the entire siege. They ate thin soup, cornmeal, mashed potatoes, sliced so thin they were almost transparent, smoked pork shaved into portions that would not have satisfied a cat. It was not comfort. It was not plenty. But it was life, and in that January, life itself was the rarest and most precious commodity on the northern plains. By late January, when the first tentative warming came, and the thermometer outside crept above zero for the first time in more than 2 weeks, Lily could stand again. She was thinner, paler, her eyes larger in her narrow face, but she was alive and the fever was gone, and the crackling in her chest had faded to a memory. She helped Clara dig out the entrance tunnel, scooping packed snow with her bare hands, until daylight broke through, harsh and brilliant, flooding the cellar with a white glare that made them both squint and shield their eyes like creatures emerging from a cave. Lily stepped outside into the snow, took 3 steps, slipped on the packed ice and fell. She sat there in the snow with the sun on her face and laughed. It was a bright, sudden, helpless sound that rose from her thin body and scattered across the frozen hills like something that had been caged for months and finally broken free. Clara stood at the entrance of the cellar and listened to her daughter laugh. And that sound, that single unrepeatable sound, made the entire winter worth every blister, every sleepless night, every stone she had carried, and every prayer she had whispered into the dark. They had survived. The earth had held, and the worst was finally behind them. The news traveled the way all news travels in country, where neighbors live miles apart slowly, at first carried by a single voice and then all at once spreading like fire across dry grass, until everyone within a day's ride had heard some version of the story. A widow and her daughter had survived the worst winter in living memory inside a hole in the ground. Not a cabin, not a dugout with timber walls and a proper frame. A cellar, dug by hand into a limestone hillside by a woman who weighed less than the stones she carried. People did not believe it at first. They had spent the winter watching the world die. They had counted their own dead, buried their cattle in mass graves dug by spring thaw, rebuilt fences that the wind had scattered like matchsticks. The idea that a woman with no money and no help and no man had done what entire families with resources and experience could not seemed less like fact and more like the kind of story people tell to make the darkness feel smaller. But the cellar was real and the woman was real, and the child who laughed in the snow was real, and one by one they came to see for themselves. Henry Dahl arrived first on a morning in early February when the air was still cold enough to crack skin, but the killing fury of January had spent itself. He rode his horse up the familiar ridge and looked down at the hillside, expecting to find what he had expected since August, a grave with no marker, a cautionary tale that confirmed everything he believed about Montana winters and the women who tried to survive them alone. Instead, he saw smoke rising from a clay chimney that protruded from what appeared to be an ordinary mound of earth and snow. He saw Clara Hargrove outside the entrance, splitting kindling on a stump with the hand axe she had carried from Elhorn, her movement steady and practiced the motions of a person who had performed this task 1,000 times and would perform it 1,000 more. He saw Lily sitting nearby on a flat rock, the geology book open on her knees, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Henry dismounted and walked to the cellar entrance. He stood there for a moment, and Clara saw something move across his face that she had never seen before, not from him, not from a man whose features had been set in stone by 20 years of solitary grief. It was uncertainty, the great immovable certainty of Henry Dahl. The certainty that winter always won that loss was the only reliable currency in Montana, that hope was a debt you could never repay. That certainty was cracking like ice on a spring river. And what lay beneath it was something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. He ducked through the entrance and stood upright inside the cellar. The warmth hit him like a hand laid gently on his chest. He stopped moving. His eyes, which had been narrowed against the outside glare, opened wide. He looked at the limestone walls glowing faintly in the light from the ventilation shaft. He looked at the iron stove, its surface warmed the solder line from Thomas Hargrove's repairs still visible along the belly. He looked at the raised sleeping platform, the drainage channel running clean along the floor, the charcoal writing on the walls where Lily had recorded their days in a child's careful hand. He looked at the thermometer, 57 degrees. He reached out and touched the wall. The stone was warm beneath his palm, warm the way living skin is warm, steady and constant, fed by something deep and patient that did not depend on fire or wood or human effort. It simply was. "This should not work," he whispered. Clara showed him everything. The thickness of the walls, the way the limestone mass absorbed heat during burning hours and released it slowly through the rest periods. The ventilation system with its 2 shafts angled to prevent direct drafts while maintaining airflow. The entrance tunnel that trapped a pocket of still air between the outside and the living space. The drainage channel lined with shale that carried groundwater out through the slope. The sod roof with its 20 centimeters of earth, now covered by an additional 2 feet of packed snow that added insulation the way a down blanket adds warmth to a bed. Henry listened without speaking. When Clara finished, he stood in the center of the cellar with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed, and the silence that filled the space between them was not empty but full heavy with everything he wanted to say and could not find words for. "I told you that you would freeze in this hole," he said finally, and his voice was not steady. "I was wrong." He left without saying more. Clara watched him ride away over the ridge, and she understood something about that man that she had not understood before. Henry Dahl had not been cruel when he told her she would die. He had been terrified, terrified that he was watching his own story repeat itself, another woman, another winter, another set of graves to visit on Sunday mornings. He had warned her away not because he did not care, but because he cared in the only way grief had left available to him, by trying to prevent the thing he could not bear to witness again. And now she had survived, and his warning had been wrong, and somewhere inside the granite fortress of his solitude a wall had shifted. Clara did not know what that would mean for Henry Dahl. She only knew that he rode away different from how he had arrived, and that the difference mattered. Maggie Lund came next. She arrived on foot, having left her horse at the base of the hills because the trail was still too icy for hooves. She was thinner than Clara remembered, her cheekbones sharp, her eyes deeper in their sockets. The winter had taken something from Maggie too. Her cabin, built of logs on the surface, had barely held above freezing through the worst of January. She had slept under 4 blankets and still woke shivering. She had burned through her entire woodpile by the end of the month and spent the first week of February breaking apart her chicken coop for fuel. The chickens were dead anyway. Maggie ducked through the entrance and stood inside the cellar and closed her eyes. She did not speak. She did not move. She stood with her arms at her sides and her palms open, absorbing the warmth the way parched ground absorbs rain, and Clara saw something she had never expected to see on Margaret Lund's face. Tears, not many, just 2. One from each eye tracking down the weathered cheeks before Maggie wiped them away with the back of her hand, as if they were an insect she was brushing off. "You did it," Maggie said. Clara nodded. There was nothing to add. Between 2 women who had lost husbands and survived winters alone, who had measured their lives in cords of wood and days of endurance, those 3 words contained everything. Maggie stayed for an hour that day. She sat on the sleeping platform and drank hot water with a piece of dried mint that Clara had found growing near the well in autumn and saved. They did not talk much. Lily showed Maggie her wall writings, the dates and names and stories, the record of their winter, written in charcoal on limestone, and Maggie read each entry with the seriousness of a woman reading scripture. When she left, she squeezed Clara's hand once at the entrance, a quick, hard pressure that said more than either of them could have managed with language. Others followed. A homesteader from the valley with his wife and 3 children, all of them gaunt from a winter that had nearly broken them. A cattle rancher who had lost 200 head and wanted to understand how a cellar could hold heat that his barn could not. The Lutheran minister, Reverend John Aldrich, who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and stood inside the cellar with his hat in his hands and his mouth slightly open, turning in a slow circle, as if he were standing inside a cathedral instead of a hole in the ground. Reverend Aldrich was the man Clara had approached in Elhorn after being evicted, asking for help from the church. He had declined with the polished regret of a man who had practiced declining. "The church cannot assist in every case, Mrs. Hargrove." His voice had been kind. His refusal had been absolute. Now he stood in the shelter she had built without his help and looked at the walls and the stove and the child's handwriting on the stone, and Clara watched him understand what he had done by doing nothing. "You built this yourself," he said. "Lily and I," Clara replied, "and a few good people." She did not say the rest. She did not need to. Aldrich heard the words she left unspoken, and he lowered his eyes, and that lowering was the closest thing to an apology Clara would receive from a man who did not believe he owed one. None of them left unchanged. Every person who stepped into that cellar and felt the impossible warmth rising from stone walls built by a woman's bleeding hands carried something away with them that they did not bring in a seat of an idea, a shift in what they believed was possible, a small fracture in the certainty that survival in Montana required timber and money and the strength of men. The last visitor of that season was Silas Brennan. He came in early spring when the snow had begun to recede and the first brown patches of earth showed through like old bruises healing. He rode alone, no surveyor this time, no company authority backing his presence. He looked diminished. The winter had been hard on the mine. 11 workers lost to illness, accidents, and desertion during the worst of the cold. Production had fallen. The owners back east had sent letters that read like threats wrapped in stationery. Brennan's position as foreman was no longer certain, and the uncertainty had stripped away whatever armor of authority he had worn in September. He stood at the cellar entrance and looked down at the stone walls glowing in the soft spring light. Clara came out to meet him. She held her homestead claim in one hand, the document she had filed in Townsend months ago now bearing the stamps and signatures that made it law. The company may dispute this claim, Brennan said, but his voice carried no conviction. It was the voice of a man reading lines from a script he no longer believed in. They can try, Clara said, but I have witnesses, and I am alive. Brennan looked at her. He saw a woman who should not have survived, a woman his system had expelled like waste, calculated, out, subtracted from the ledger. And here she stood, not merely alive, but rooted, established, proven. She had built something outside the system that had controlled her husband's life and discarded his death, and she had built it from the ground up using nothing the system had given her. Every stone in that wall was a refutation of everything Brennan served. He understood, standing there in the spring light, that Clara Hargrove had not beaten him. She had not needed to. She had simply made him irrelevant, and irrelevance for a man whose entire identity was built on being necessary to a system that used people like fuel was worse than defeat. He turned to leave, and then Lily emerged from the cellar behind her mother. The girl was thin from the winter, her face still narrow from the weeks of fever, but her eyes were clear and sharp and fixed on Brennan with an intensity that stopped him mid-stride. She reached into the small pack she still carried everywhere and pulled out a folded piece of paper creased and softened by months of handling, the edges worn round by the constant pressure of small fingers. The funeral invoice, $47. The price the company had charged to bury her father. Mr. Brennan, Lily said, and her voice was steady in a way that no 9-year-old's voice should need to be. You charged $47 to put my papa in the ground, but you did not pay my mama anything when he died. She bent down and placed the paper on the ground between them, weighting it with a stone so the spring wind would not carry it away. Then she straightened and looked at Brennan once more, a look that held no hatred, no plea, no childish fury, only the calm finality of someone closing a book they have finished reading. You can keep that, she said, and she turned and walked back into the cellar without looking at him again. Brennan stared at the paper under its stone. The wind moved the grass around him. A meadowlark called from somewhere on the hillside, the first bird song of spring, bright and careless and perfectly indifferent to the man standing alone on the slope with his mouth open and nothing in his hands. He rode away. He did not come back. That moment belonged to Lily. It was the moment she stopped being a child who needed protection and became a person who had chosen deliberately and with full understanding to release the weight she had carried since Elhorn. She did not need the invoice anymore. She did not need evidence of what the company had done to her father because she and her mother had already provided the only evidence that mattered. They were alive. They had endured. The paper was a relic of a story that no longer had power over them, and laying it down was Lily's way of saying so. Clara watched her daughter walk back into the cellar, and she felt something complete itself, a circle that had begun in August when she held a frightened girl's hand and stepped off a company porch into the unknown. They had arrived at this place as refugees. They stood here now as something else. Not victors, not heroes, just two people who had refused to disappear when the world decided they were disposable and who had dug their survival out of the earth with their own hands. By summer of 1887, 7 families had begun digging shelters of their own in the limestone hills using the methods Clara taught them. She walked to each site sometimes with Lily beside her and showed them what she knew. How to choose a south-facing slope for maximum sun exposure, how to test limestone for density by striking it with a hammer and listening to the ring. A high clear tone meant good stone, a dull thud meant weakness. How to angle drainage channels so groundwater flowed out instead of pooling in. How to build the entrance tunnel with a turn in it, creating a natural windbreak. How to calculate the wood savings, how to position ventilation shafts, how to mix mortar that would hold through freeze and thaw. The families who came to learn were not destitute, not all of them. Some were ranchers who had lost so many cattle that they could no longer afford to buy enough wood for their surface cabins. Some were homesteaders who had watched their neighbors die and decided that the old way of building was a form of gambling they were no longer willing to play. Some were simply curious, drawn by a story that sounded impossible, until they stepped inside the cellar and felt the warmth on their faces and realized that impossible was just a word people used for things they had not yet tried. Clara taught without ceremony or pride. She showed them what worked and warned them about what did not. She told them about the night she let the fire go out and the way the temperature held at 51 degrees while the world above froze at 46 below, and she watched their faces change as they understood what that meant. She did not call it genius or innovation. She called it what Bestamore had called it, listening to the earth. There was one family Clara remembered above all the others. The Hendersons, a young couple with a baby born that spring, living in a canvas tent while they built a cabin they knew they could not finish before November. The wife, Sarah Henderson, was 19 years old and had not stopped shaking since the previous winter when she and her husband had huddled in a way station for 4 days during the worst of the cold, listening to cattle die outside and wondering if they would be next. When Sarah stepped inside Clara's cellar and felt the warmth, she began to cry so hard she could not stand. Her husband caught her and held her, and Clara looked away to give them privacy because she understood that Sarah was not crying from sadness, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of a fear she had carried for so long. It had become part of her body, and feeling safe, truly safe for the first time in a year, had broken the dam. Clara showed the Hendersons how to dig their shelter. She visited their site 3 times during the autumn. When their baby fell ill in October and Sarah was too exhausted to work, Clara and Lily spent 2 days helping finish the drainage channel. They did not speak about it afterward. It was simply what you did when someone needed help and you had hands. Lily went with her and told the children of these families about stone. She carried the quartz pebble, the singer, in her pocket, and she held it up to their ears and told them to listen. Rocks remember everything, she said with the conviction of a child who had spent a winter writing on limestone walls and reading about ancient seas. This one remembers being part of a mountain. The walls of our cellar remember being the bottom of an ocean. If you listen, they will tell you. The children listened because children always listen when another child speaks with that kind of certainty, and some of them would carry the memory of Lily Hargrove and her singing stone for the rest of their lives. By winter of 1887, 4 of the 7 shelters were complete. That winter was hard again, though not as savage as the year before, and all 4 families survived in warmth that their neighbors in surface cabins could not comprehend. The following year, 6 more were built, then a dozen. The idea spread across the hills the way grass spreads across a prairie, slowly, silently following the contours of the land, until what had begun as one woman's desperate gamble became a way of life for an entire community. Clara proved her homestead claim and received title to the land. She built a small frame house above the cellar in the spring of 1888, using the cellar as a basement and root storage. The house was modest: 4 rooms, a covered porch, a kitchen garden on the south side, but it stood on ground she owned, and no company foreman would ever hand her an eviction notice again. She remarried 3 years later. Samuel Harding was a stonemason from Helena who had come to Townsend to build a church foundation and heard about the woman who had built limestone walls underground that professional masons came to study. He rode out to see for himself, and what he found was not just impressive construction, but a woman who understood stone the way he did, as a living material with moods and memories, and a willingness to cooperate if you treated it with respect. He admired her walls before he admired her courage, which Clara later said was the reason she trusted him. Any man could be impressed by bravery. It took a particular kind of man to be impressed by a well-fitted joint. The marriage was quiet and good, the kind of peace that only people who have survived storms know how to value. Samuel never tried to improve Clara's cellar. He said it was already perfect, which was not entirely true, but was exactly the right thing to say. Maggie Lund remained Clara's closest friend for the rest of her life. The 2 women drank tea together every week for 30 years, speaking little, needing to speak less. Maggie never rebuilt her chicken coop. She said the chickens had been more trouble than they were worth, which was her way of saying that the winter of 1887 had stripped her life down to what mattered, and what mattered did not include poultry. She died at 78 in her sleep in the cabin she had maintained alone for 3 decades, and Clara was the one who found her sitting upright in her chair with a cup of cold tea on the table beside her, looking as if she had simply decided that she had endured enough winters and it was time to rest. Henry Dahl, the spring after the great winter, rode up to his wife's grave on the hill behind his homestead and did something he had not done in 8 years. He dug, not a grave, a shelter, a small earth-walled chamber beside the cottonwood tree where Martha and the twins lay buried, just large enough for a man to sit in out of the wind. He lined it with limestone and sealed it with clay the way Clara had shown him. He did not live in it. He visited. On cold Sundays when the wind cut across the hilltop and the cottonwood creaked with frost, Henry sat in his small, warm chamber beside his family and spoke to them the way he had not been able to speak to the frozen ground above. For Martha, he told Clara when she asked about it. So she is warm. It was the first time anyone had seen Henry Dahl cry since 1879, and it was the last. Owen Slade did not return to Elkhorn. He traveled west to Oregon and became a carpenter, building houses from wood with a precision that his employers admired and his co-workers found excessive. 10 years after leaving Montana, he sent a letter to Clara. It was short, 4 sentences written in a hand that shook slightly. Inside the envelope were $47 in clean bills. Not the company's money, he wrote. Mine, for the funeral. Clara did not keep the money. She gave it to Lily, who was 19 by then, tall and quiet, and possessed of her father's patience and her mother's unbreakable will. Lily used the $47 to buy books on geology, mineralogy, and the science of the earth. She became a teacher. She taught children in Montana about the ground beneath their feet, about limestone and quartz, and the ancient seas whose ghosts lived in the walls of their homes, and she carried the Singer in her pocket every day until she was an old woman with white hair and steady hands and a voice that could make a room full of restless children go still just by saying, listen. Clara Hargrove died in 1921, 34 years after the winter that should have killed her. She died in the house she had built above the cellar in the bedroom that faced south toward the limestone bluffs, with Samuel beside her and Lily holding her hand. She was 67 years old. Her hands, even at the end, bore the calluses and scars of that first desperate summer, ridges of thickened skin across her palms that she had carried like medals for 3 decades. Samuel once told a neighbor that he could read the story of her life in her hands the way other people read books, every scar a chapter, every callus a lesson learned in the hardest possible school. The mining town of Elkhorn had long since faded by then. Its company houses collapsed, its mine shafts flooded, its foremen and owners and ledgers forgotten. Silas Brennan had left Montana in 1892 after the company closed the mine, and no one knew where he went or what became of him. Some said he went to Colorado to manage another mine. Some said he went back east. Clara did not think about him. He had ceased to matter the moment she picked up the hand axe and began to dig, and the years between then and now had buried him under layers of living the way sediment buries the bones of forgotten creatures. The hard winters of the 1880s had become stories that old men told on porches, shaking their heads at the memory of cold they could still feel in their bones. The Great Die-Up passed into legend, a cautionary tale about the arrogance of open-range ranching and the indifference of weather to human plans. The school children of Montana learned about it from textbooks that reduced the suffering of thousands to a paragraph and a date. But in the limestone hills near Townsend, the memory was different. There, the story was not about death, it was about a woman who dug. But the shelter Clara built still stood, quiet, steady, warm in the heart of the earth. The limestone walls she had raised with bleeding hands still held the heat of forgotten summers. The drainage channel still carried water cleanly through the slope. The charcoal writing on the walls, Lily's careful record of their winter, had faded but not disappeared. And if you stood inside on a cold day and pressed your palm flat against the stone, you could still feel it. The breath of the earth, Jorda Puster, the warmth that does not forget. The earth does not ask where you come from. It does not judge what you have lost. It does not care whether you are strong or weary, wealthy or ruined, a man with authority or a woman with $7 and a child. It holds the same warmth for all of them, patient and steady and deep, asking nothing in return except that you trusted enough to dig. Clara Hargrove dug into the limestone hills of Montana, not to challenge winter, not to prove a point, not to defeat the men who had thrown her away. She dug to save the only thing she had left in the world. And the earth, which remembers everything and forgets nothing, answered her the only way it knows how, with warmth, with silence, with time.